The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, leading Democratic pollster Stanley Greenberg reads the exit polls for what they tell us about both parties moving forward. Author Derek Black on why an assault on public education is an assault on democracy itself. And Bill Press with Georgia Congressman Hank Johnson on the battle for control of the Senate. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Pollster Stanley Greenberg has just begun to dig into the numbers on election 2020 and what they tell us about a changing American electorate. Even with Biden's win, Greenberg sees an unfinished battle over politics and the issue of race in America. And we say hello to Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster and founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps. He's also the author, most recently, of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stan Greenberg, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I am delighted to be here, and there's a lot to sort out.
Yes, there is, and it is nice to have you back. We last spoke in August. We were fairly confident. We weren't 100% sure, but now we're feeling a little bit better, that's for sure. However, still a lot of analysis, no doubt, that will go into understanding the hows and whys that Joe Biden won this election. You recently credited President-elect Biden with making a particular effort to attract more working-class white women. Did that work for him?
I don't think he would have broken through the blue wall without that effort. If you look at how close those three states were, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there's no doubt in my mind. And also, if you look at the gains he made in Western Pennsylvania and in the suburbs, in Michigan, that was done to white working class women playing a key part. Now, This was an election in which Donald Trump waged a race war. I mean, he turned this campaign into a race war, unapologetically, focused on black, fear of blacks, defund the police, law and order, total focus that produced a surge of white working class voters into the electorate, rural too, but broader number of white working class voters. He got the men back to where they were in 16. So if the women held, and we have them actually stable from where they were in the midterms, they did not follow the men across that line, then they were the difference. He wouldn't have had those margins in those three states without them.
Now, Biden himself and Vice President-elect Harris have given great credit to black voters and black organizers for their role in his victory. What can we take away from the level of support that Biden received from black voters?
Look, blacks are the stars of this election. They're the stars within the progressive coalition. And you obviously, have to really focus a lot of your analysis, on them. They did not increase their vote as a proportion of the electorate because there was such a big increase in white working class voters. And so as that vote went way up, the black voters held their share, but they didn't take a further movement that enabled Biden to do well. He wouldn't have won without them. He wouldn't have won without that level of support. But we also need to have, I think, some perspective. It used to be with Jewish voters, if there were more than 10% that voted Republican, that there was something wrong, that there was somehow alienated the Jewish vote. Well, the Jewish vote is complicated. You have a growing number of Orthodox. that vote Republican, and Jews are complicated, but still you have Democrats winning 85% of Jews. And if you look at what's happened with blacks, which is about 10%, voting for Trump, but a higher number of men. But still, even if you go to the men and say, look, this is a group that's voting 80% for you and 20% for the Republicans, you know what? That's kind of normal. That there is, you can't just have a kind of a civil rights divide in every election that's going to produce that kind of unity in every election. We should welcome and try to have more and more black voters and black men participate, if they're going to give us 80, 20. Now, that number, meant that, Biden's margin was a little bit down, in Detroit, where Trump did better. His vote was 20% higher, in Detroit. If you look overall at the Georgia vote, it's the white working class voters that are, and rural voters that are, that are driving the change in the composition of the electorate. But you would not be in play, you would not be in the game if you didn't have such overwhelming support with black voters, including women and men.
Mm-hmm. And I want to stay on folks of color in particularly the Latinx vote. Mm-hmm. I wasn't, and I would assume that you probably wouldn't have been too surprised by the results. Well, let me back up. Overall, Biden won the overall Latinx vote. Yes. But in Florida, with a heavy Cuban and Venezuelan population and the constant advertisement by the Trump administration of socialism, he lost down there somewhat. But what really surprised me was the Rio Grande Valley and the amount of support that President Trump had, especially given the way that he disparages on Mexican Americans, mm-hmm. and quite frankly, folks of all Latinx descent. I really found that as a head scratcher. What did you see with that overall group of folks? I try to respect voters in terms of their identity, and their identity is such a big part of how they come to politics in the end. So I always ask people what you use to identify yourself. First of all, I didn't want to use African American because blacks do not use African American. A very small percentage of blacks use African American. So for years, I just fought, using it. I gave in, I think, to the elites and used it, but now I've given it up. Everybody recognizes blacks call themselves black and identify as black. Okay. But when you get to Latino, and I didn't use Latino because I asked a question and said, what do you call yourself? You have some that call Mexican American. Hispanic was the biggest group. Latino was like a 15, 20%. It was not the dominant phrase that people use for themselves. But that's a clue, I think, as to when you think about Latinos, and I put that in quotes, that's not who they identify with. And if you look at the Texas piece and that story we've read about, in the Rio Grande Valley, it's people who call themselves Mexican American and voted in very different ways. Even though Sanders had done well there, and Clinton had done well there. Clearly, you had Trump competing for these voters, and we now know you're going to compete for these voters. Some of it is mischief. I mean, some of this is the Russians, and a lot of kind of, both in the Black community and Latinos as well, a lot of this is a lot of traffic, that is saying both parties, are crap. They neither one of this serves the Russians, but it also serves the Republicans. They say none of them have delivered for you, and what do you have to lose, which is Trump's, message. But you also have, another overlay here of masculinity. And the way Trump reached across all groups and did better with black men, but also with Hispanic and Latino men, and so there's just more going on there. But let me also add one side thing, because it has to do with how cynical the Trump campaign was. In 2016, they ran on immigration and also in the midterms, 18. They went to the wall, sent the troops, talked about the caravans coming from Central America, hiding terrorists, and we had to stop them. We had to build the wall. Okay.
Trump stopped talking about immigration, stopped talking about Hispanics, stopped talking about Mexicans. And in our 2016 post-election survey and midterms, the top reason to vote Republican was immigration. This year was 7th. So if you listen to the rallies, Trump's rallies, he did not talk about immigration. It was totally the threat of blacks and the violence that was going to come with blacks invading your suburbs and your community, and law and order and needing to back police. And I think that also allowed to get a little bit of support in places like Texas in the Latino community. But it was a tactic, cynical tactic on the part of Trump, but effective tactic that allowed many more identities to come into play as people voted in this election.
That almost suggests that if he had just kept his mouth shut altogether, he'd have done a lot better. I mean, just my take on that one. This election, of course, Stanley, will go on record as having one of the biggest turnouts, even in a pandemic, which was something. And there has always been that rule of thumb that high turnout will often benefit Democrats. That seems to have played out pretty well here.
No, it's not played out. It did not play out well for Democrats, in this election at all. In fact, it's the opposite is the case for this election. So let's talk that through, because it's very important to the future of the Republican Party. It's very important to understanding what happened in this election and why many of us assumed this was going to be, I think, a bigger margin for Democrats nationally as well as in the battleground states. We had in the midterms, historically, the highest turnout in a midterm election virtually in the country's history. Democrats won by 10 million votes. And we know that produced a particular big increase with suburban voters that drove the blue wave. Now, as we watched these coming elections, we watched the lines that were outside early voting and other things, and we watched the huge number of ballots that were cast before the election. We basically made the assumption. I made the assumption that this is going to be the biggest turnout in maybe in the country's history, but that turns out to be since 1900, since William Jennings Bryan. It was a huge, turnout. And my assumption was that all groups would increase their turnout comparable, equally. But that turned out to be not true. We had a modest increase in turnout, with blacks. We had a good increase with millennials. But we had a huge increase with white working class voters, with new voters coming in. Most of the new voters, most of the people who hadn't voted before, were Trump voters, were white working class Trump voters. And so the thing that flipped the electorate was this surge of voters that came in the battleground states where Trump was holding his rallies. So that's a big event. It changed the electorate. And if you look at Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, you had this big increase, in some places 10 points, from 40% to 50% being white working class compared to 2018. So there was just a flip of who was voting, in this high historic turnout election. And it was driven by Trump voters, not by Biden voters. And that's why this election looked, very different, and why it fell short of what we would like to have had.
It's interesting because the optics of it, and when you saw those long lines of people and you heard about all these young people coming out, you automatically thought it's got to be the Democrats. It's got to be the Democrats. And here we find out we were all wrong. We're speaking to Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, also the author of multiple books, most recently R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. All right, so it was a closer election than many anticipated, for sure, with more support going to Trump than expected. What do we know about where that support came from?
It was just overwhelmingly white working class and rural. And it was white working class men, and rural. He had some erosion, amongst Latinos that enabled him to hold off Florida, and Texas. But if you look at the composition of the people that voted for Trump in the battleground state, it was just overwhelmingly rural voters, overwhelmingly white working class voters, and particularly men. There's one other piece, seniors, in the battleground states. Again, the battleground states are different than the nation as a whole. Overall, if you look at it, Biden did better with seniors. And if you look at what happened with COVID, and all the polls coming into this had Biden doing surprisingly well with seniors. Well, we've looked at the exits. We'll have other data later, but the biggest actual switch seemed to be seniors who were listening to the law and order drumbeat in the end, rather than COVID, which was a much more emotional and fear that led them to flip their votes in almost all of the battleground states where Trump was campaigning and where they were running ads.
Moving ahead, both parties are facing their own kind of reckoning. And you've written extensively about the GOP and have described it as a party at war with itself. So we'll start with the GOP. What lessons might the GOP learn about its own future from this election?
So I think this is going to be fatal for the Republicans. And I know that's going to seem surprising because they did surprisingly well compared to what people thought would happen. I thought they would have a shattering election. And if the election looked like what we thought it was when we last spoke, they would have been in pieces. Trump would have been repudiated. And, they would then have an internal battle to figure out what their future looks like. What we have is that they waged this race war, in which drove away suburban voters, drove away millennials. They lost millennials by a landslide, all young voters, millennials, voters under 40 by a landslide, suburban voters by a landslide, reacting against a Trump presidency that was focused totally on racial strife, building up racial conflict, which they hated. Okay, but he succeeded in that. That is in not being repudiated. So he owns the Republican Party. So rather than us watching a party trying to figure out what to do post-Trump, we now have a party that's owned by Trump. And so think of the consequence of that they can't make any decision without Trump. Will he be loyal to them? Can they depend on him, in 4 years, to be for them and work for them? Will he become caught up in bankruptcy and sexual assault, cases that go to trial and get delegitimated? But above all, they don't even know whether he can deliver unless he's on the ballot. We know he delivered a huge turnout in 2016 and a historic turnout in 2020, and it helped Republicans more than Democrats. Okay. But he was not able to do it in the midterms. He campaigned on all these issues. He went to the wall again. As I said, he tried to raise all the tempers and fears on immigrants. It didn't work. It didn't raise turnout. Didn't block the blue wave. And if we looked at the governor's races and the rallies he held in Kentucky and Louisiana, didn't work. It's only worked when he's on the ballot. Now, so you're now owned by Donald Trump, but you don't know whether he can deliver. You have this huge uncertainty on whether he can deliver wins or an increase in turnout. I'm skeptical that it could be done again. I mean, I didn't think this could be done. He was successful in raising historic turnout. He's kept the proportion in the battleground state, proportion white at 75%, even though it's gotten more diverse, much more diverse. But he has kept the electorate in these 16 battleground states at 75% white, and he's done that by having a race war in order to get his voters out. If you look at the kind of fear that he built it on, he's also kept the white working class electorate at half the electorate. even though it's been declining outside of it. Now, can you continue that? Well, how do you deal with the millennials? Millennials were 30% of the vote in this election. They're going to increase by 10%. Nothing will stop the fact that there's going to have this huge increase of millennials. And they're running every year as against blacks and immigrants. They're running every year against keeping people from voting. And in fact, they will go further. Everything we're watching is that they will do everything possible to suppress the vote. And so they are Trump's party, and have own Trump strategy and can't evolve out of this anti-immigrant, anti-black mindset because he owns them. And that's how they're going to wage their battles for the South when you have governors' races in North Carolina and in Georgia and Florida and Texas. They're going to be in that same mindset. But it didn't work in those states. The trend toward Democrats in every one of those states continued, even though they waged this race war to increase the turnout.
Now, given that, all right, so Trump loses this election. Every case that has gone to, it hasn't even gone to court. The judges have just said, no, don't even bring that to me, in trying to get the election turned around. It seems to me, and of course, he hates the media, the mainstream media. He doesn't even like Fox anymore. But he's not going to be on television every day. He's not going to be in the newspaper every day for the next 4 years. Does that star start to fade and go away? And then does this allow Republicans that are in office now the opportunity to maybe slightly move away from Trump and his message of the last 4 years?
He's going to be tweeting. He's going to have he'll have a major media presence. And they will remain fearful. I mean, just look at, even the small suggestion that you have the intelligence brief produced a firestorm against the senator who tried to offer it. No, I think he's going to be tweeting. In some sense, he will be even more unconstrained in terms of waging war against those who he resents and failed him and were not loyal to him. And I think they're going to be operating as if he's in the backdrop, and any tweets from Trump puts them at risk.
That's just unbelievable.
What a world.
It really
so in some ways it's worse for the Republican Party, because they can't have now a debate of, all right, now what should our party look like given the changes in the country? No, they are locked into this party that he saved from destruction. But he did it in a way by waging a race war that branded the party as anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-diversity, in a country that rejects all of that.
All right, now let's move on to the Biden presidency and the Democratic Party. Biden says he will work for unity in the party and in the country. In terms of the party first, what are the fault lines that the president-elect has to take on? And do you have a sense of how he should mend some of those fault lines?
I think that this is all going to be taken over by what you have to do. If you see the package that he talked about already to get out the relief package that he wants to get through the Congress. Now, if the Republicans still control the Senate, they've said we're not doing that, and so you're going to have an immediate battle on the relief package. And it may be, and I suspect McConnell is going to have the same strategy because he thinks it worked for him last time against Obama. We're going to try to make Biden fail. And so I don't think you're going to get to the big fault lines. I think Biden is going to be proposing, and it may be true even if we have the Senate, because it will only be if we have it, it'll be by one vote. You're going to see him doing major relief package. You're going to be seeing doing his bold, radical climate change plans, which are his very broad agreement. His healthcare plans, which include lowering the Medicare age, creating a public option with no deductibles. I mean, all the things that they've agreed to that are not that radical, but that have broad support amongst Democrats. And so I think in the short term, certainly up to the midterms, you're going to deal with a party that's largely united and have to be united. If Biden has any chance of passing these things and any chance of fighting the Republicans, in the Senate. And you may end up with a fault line an ironic fault line, which deals with the desire of the country to raise taxes on the rich, raise taxes on corporations, raise taxes on wealth. Because what happened, with this racist campaign that Trump ran, increased the white working class part of the electorate, but they're very populist and they want to tax the rich. Trump's formula is actually pretty populist, and anti-elitist, but these voters want to tax the corporations and the rich. And so they're for the things that Biden has said he wanted to do. And so what happens if the Republicans block any effort to tax the corporations and the rich in order to, fund the programs, which they will if they have the votes to do so. They will. They'll block it. You could then have a kind of disillusionment that set in with Trump when he did not deliver affordable health care, when he went to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, but did not deliver the affordable great insurance and that rural voters and white working class voters were desperate for. And that's where he lost them. What happens if these voters that he's brought into the electorate for him find that these then want to stay with the elites, that McConnell is really with the elites, and that in some way he may even get support from Trump, oddly, from the outside. But it's a more complicated battle, and Republicans will pay a price if they not just try to keep him from succeeding and governing, but doing it in a particular way to protect the corporations and the top 1%.
Mm-hmm. And now the bigger question. President-elect Biden also talks about unity in the country as a whole. You're someone who has been examining American attitudes for decades. How would you compare this moment of polarization with others that you've seen, and is unity even possible?
No.
And so ends our program for today. I almost knew you were going to say what you were going to say, but so what can be done?
Yeah, the reason is because Trump succeeded in avoiding a wipeout and holding on potentially to the Senate, but certainly it's close. And the Republican Party is still owned by Trump. It's still Trump's party. They're going to be a California party waging the battles, in Georgia, North Carolina, in the Sun Belt, where you're going to have all these governor's races 2 years from now. So this is kind of an unfinished battle, because it wasn't totally repudiated. Even though he waged his race war and lost the election, Biden owns the presidency and will play a huge role in defining the Trump presidency and what the new agenda will be for the country. It still looks unfinished, that the battle's unfinished, in the country, and it'll simply carry on. I'm afraid it'll carry on. Look, if we can have the Senate, it'll be a huge difference. If we have real control of the whole federal government, that'll change a lot. And I keep my fingers crossed, that Georgia delivers the Senate and us having full control of the country. But if it doesn't, I think McConnell will wage the same battle to make Biden fail. But you'll also have the continuation of the battle in the midterms, but in the states, where you're going to have Trump-like governor candidates waging battles against the kind of candidates, diverse candidates Democrats have fielded, in North Carolina and Georgia, Florida and Texas.
Okay. Stanley Greenberg, leading Democratic pollster, founding partner of Greenberg Research and Democracy Corps, and, of course, the author most recently of R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stan, as always, it was great having you with us today. We'd love to do it again soon.
Terrific. Provocative questions, provocative times.
Thank you very much for your time. We'll talk to you soon. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the historical link between public education and American democracy, and why it's now under assault. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's time to talk turkey. No, not the butterball sitting in the Oval Office. I'm talking about the real thing, the big bird, 46 million of which we Americans will devour on this Thanksgiving Day. It was the Aztecs who first domesticated the gallo pavo, but leave it to the Spanish explorers to foul up the bird's origins. They declared it to be related to the peacock. Wrong. They also thought the peacock originated in Turkey. Wrong. And they thought Turkey was located in Africa. Well, you can see the Spanish were pretty confused. Actually, the origin of Thanksgiving is confused. The popular assumption is that it was first celebrated by the Mayflower immigrants and the Wampanoag natives at Plymouth, Massachusetts, 1621. They feasted on venison, furkeys, Wampanoag for gobblers, eels, mussels, corn, and beer. But wait, say Virginians, the first precursor to our annual November Foodapalooza was not in Massachusetts. The Thanksgiving feast originated down here in Jamestown Colony back in 1608. Whoa there, hold your horses, pilgrims. Folks in El Paso, Texas, say it all began way out there in 1598, when Spanish settlers sat down with the people of the Piro and Manso tribes, gave thanks, then feasted on roasted duck, geese, and fish. Ha, says a Florida group, asserting that the very, very first Thanksgiving happened in 1565, when the Spanish settlers of San Augustine and friends from the Timuacan tribe chowed down on cocido, a stew of salt pork, garbanzo beans, and garlic, washing it all down with red wine. This is Jim Hightower saying, wherever it began and whatever the purists claim is official, Thanksgiving today is as multicultural as America. So let's enjoy, kick back, give thanks we're in a country with such ethnic richness, and dive into your turkey rellenos, mushu turkey, turkey falafel, barbecue.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Derek W. Black is a legal scholar and outspoken advocate of the importance of public education. His newest book explores how a constitutional right to education forever changed the trajectory of our democracy and what it means when it comes under attack. And we say hello to Derek Black, professor at the University of South Carolina Law School, where he teaches constitutional law, civil rights, and education law. He's also the author, most recently, of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education, and the Assault on American Democracy. Derek Black, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. As your new book informs us, the centrality of public education to the realization of democracy goes back to the founding of America. How and why did the founders guarantee that public education was woven into the fabric of the new nation?
Yeah, I mean, America, we forget, was really a radical idea back in the late 1700s. We really had a world that was ruled by kings and monarchs, and America was radical in saying, look, we're going to hand over power to the common man. Unfortunately, it was not women at that time, but we're handing it over. And, that was a bit of a scary thing for a lot of the elites that were talking about it, Adams, Jefferson and Washington and the like. And so the idea was, if we're going to hand this thing over to regular voters, we need those voters to be educated. And so this idea of public education is deeply sort of embedded in the democratic ideology of Washington and Jefferson and Adams. But the first place where you really see that idea take place or sort of take hold in our legal system is in the Northwest Ordinance. So after we declare independence and before we actually have a constitution, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation, right? This sort of pre-constitutional system. And at that moment in time, Congress comes up with the Northwest Ordinance that says we need a plan for how this nation's going to grow, how we're going to have new states, how we're going to expand westward. And so they passed the Northwest Ordinances. And in those Northwest Ordinances, they required that every single town that would be created in the remainder of the United States would have a public square at the middle of those towns to be reserved for public schools, right? And so it says that public education shall forever be encouraged, and in each town, the center lot, they actually even had it numbered, the lot 16 in the middle of all these little towns across America would be the place for public schools, and they'd set aside about 1/9 of the remaining land to generate resources to fund those schools. And so that document is key. And a lot of people go, well, but yeah, we had a constitution, doesn't that supersede it? Well, actually, the Northwest Ordinance and the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, were part of one big package. First of all, the same people who were voting on the Northwest Ordinance, many of them were voting on the Constitutional Convention. In fact, they had some of the Constitutional Convention delegates had to leave Philadelphia and ride up to New York so they could have a quorum to pass the Northwest Ordinance. But the other part was there was a land deal in there whereby all the states gave up their claims to the West. And if they gave those claims up, then the United States Constitution would move in to sort of govern the nation moving forward. So education, part of westward expansion, part of the creation of the Constitution, and part of every little town in America after that document.
And there were important turning points along the way to perfect this promise of an education for everyone. For example, what happened after the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one critique you could make of that early Northwest Ordinance era that I was referencing is that, America still had slaves, was still depriving a lot of folks of education. And although they had this idea of public education, they hadn't really figured out how to pay for it and make sure it was systematic. So when the nation is trying to rise from the ashes of the Civil War, Congress recognizes the fatal flaws of its first attempt at education, and realizes that slavery was part of that as well. I mean, slaves were legally prohibited from learning to read and write in the South. And even whites had a lot of restrictions on them, right? The South restricted certain ideas, it restricted certain books. There was this hierarchy of information in the South that basically said there's only one set of ideas that we're going to allow, and those are pro-slavery ideas. And as you begin to diverge from them, even white folks could be lynched and maybe not lynched, but at least sort of beaten and jailed over it. So Congress says, look, if we're going to have a real democracy in the South, not just one on paper, but a real one, we've got to make sure that there's a public education system that everyone can access. And so as a condition for readmission to the Union, Congress required Southern states to rewrite their constitutions. And one of the key pieces of rewriting them was to include constitutional clauses in those constitutions that guaranteed the right to education. So before the Civil War, less than half of the nation's states guaranteed education in their state constitutions. Less than half of them required the state to provide it. All 10 of the states who were readmitted during Reconstruction changed and said, no, we are now obligating education. So we jumped to about 80% of states once the South did that. And then even in the North, following the Civil War, they began to adopt the same types of ideas and education articles in their constitution, so that by the late 1800s, every single state, except for Connecticut, had an affirmative obligation in their constitution requiring states to provide public education. So it was really a radical time in moving from sort of a laissez-faire approach to expanding education to a constitutional mandate to expand education.
But even as there were those who fought to expand public education, your book tells the stories of those who sought to undermine public education. And in doing so, they undermined democracy itself. Is it your argument that was their intent? Take, for example, the segregationists of the Jim Crow era.
Yeah, no doubt it was. I mean, I think the thing, when you look at the broad scope of American history, that education and the right to vote have always gone hand in hand, right? I said earlier, the founders were concerned about voters who didn't have education, and then after Reconstruction, Congress was particularly concerned about the freedmen who'd been prohibited from reading and writing now becoming, voting citizens. And so those things have always gone hand in hand. The other side of the story is, if you want to undermine someone's vote, one way to do that, right, is to undermine their education. So when Mississippi met in its famous, late 1800s convention, they said, we have come here to change our Constitution for one reason and one reason only, and that is to disenfranchise African Americans, right? Reconstruction was over, the North had withdrawn, and they said, we want to put African Americans back where they were before. And so that convention did two things. It began to make it harder to vote, and it segregated schools and made them harder to fund. And so they saw those things as closely aligned. In fact, some of the debates in the Constitutional Convention in Mississippi, I think 1890 is the year, some of those debates were, well, if we impose these literacy requirements for voting, that's only going to protect the white status quo for so long, because African American education is expanding, they're getting these skills, they are going to get this right to vote, even if there are literacy tests. And so, one answer to that is we need to restrict education as well to try to hold African Americans back as much as possible. So unfortunately, yes, it was their intent to use education as a tool to affect the ballot box and to try to put African Americans back into a status very close to slavery days.
And Derek, while Brown versus Board solved in part the issue of segregation, it also produced a backlash. How did that backlash take shape?
Yeah, at some point, the segregation. The first idea was after losing a number of cases in the Supreme Court, Brown 1, Brown 2, and Cooper versus Aaron and others, they said, well, look, maybe we can just do away with public education altogether. So Virginia came up with this idea that they would just voucherize education, or rather they'd say, look, we're just closing the schools in Prince Edward County, and anybody who wants to go to school can have a voucher, and they'll go to private school. And of course, whites were all for this, so we had a lot of whites enrolling in private schools where the court couldn't control whether they were segregated or not. African Americans, interestingly enough, said, we're not up for that deal. We're not up for closing public education. And so rather than go to segregated private schools, African Americans actually just were denied education altogether for a few years there in Virginia. But the court pushes back on that idea and says, look, you can't just sort of close public education altogether as a way of getting around integration. And so there is this sense that integration is going to happen no matter what the South tries. And so instead of fighting public education altogether or fighting integration per se, we need to find a way to scale it back. And President Nixon, to be quite honest, was pretty instrumental in that. He handpicked a series of Supreme Court justices who had been opposed to Brown versus Board of Education itself, to be quite honest. He began putting them on the courts with the explicit purpose of rolling back those victories. And once he got, Powell, Berger, those two in particular, on the court, he had the numbers, or they had the numbers to roll back Brown. And so, that sort of mandate to equalize schools, that mandate to integrate schools, the idea of education as a fundamental right, all those things got cut short in the 1970s. And, we've been trying to claw our way back ever since then, to be quite honest.
We're speaking with Derek Black, professor at the University of South Carolina Law School, where he teaches constitutional law, civil rights, and education law. And he's also the author, most recently, of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. Bringing the discussion to the current day, you've written that Trump and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos are executing a very dangerous new phase of the assault on public education. You've written about their attempt to cast government schools as the enemy of education freedom. How do they try to sell this idea?
Yeah, it's really a two-pronged approach, depending on who their audience is, they use one or the other first. But, one of the ideas is just to paint the public schools as utterly failing, and that they are an outdated idea. And, for me, that is highly problematic when you look at the history that I've just talked about, which is public education has always been part of expanding equality and opportunity and democracy. And, just going back to Jim Crow again, restrictions on public education or attacks on it were a part of restricting democracy. So, they don't acknowledge that history. They somehow or another want to stand outside of history. But they attack public schools as a flawed idea, as you said, that they're government schools and that they're just failing our children. The other side of this, or the other ploy, is to co-opt language that sounds like equality, that sounds like civil rights, for instance. And most of that, as you say, sort of education freedom, right? That what we want to do is free people to make choices, with the idea being that if everyone was free to make choices, education would just get better. Well, first of all, when they say choice, they mean private school choice. And there is nothing in history that shows that the private system actually has the capacity to serve all of our kids. That was one of the huge problems pre-Civil War, was that we were so reliant on the private system and it lacked capacity, right? And of course, school choice has been a way that, elites and primarily whites try to flee from, minority students and leave them behind. But nonetheless, they are selling snake oil, so to speak, sort of dressing up education freedom and education choice as a liberating idea, as an equality idea, when that's just not true as a matter of history. And they're attacking public education as the enemy of freedom and equality, when again, that's the opposite of what history teaches us.
When you look at specific policies advocated by the administration, what are some of the most threatening in terms of undermining the very goals of public education?
Yeah, one of the first, when it came right out of the box, as soon as DeVos and Trump were in office, they made their first budget proposal. And, we have, I don't want to get too wonky on this, but the short story is the biggest chunk of money that the feds spend on public education is called Title I, and it goes out based upon the number of poor kids you have. Well, what the administration initially, and they've continued to argue for it every year, what they've argued for was that we should take that money that goes to public schools for low-income students and basically convert it into choice programs. So instead of giving money to the schools that have the highest concentration of low-income students, we would use that money for choice programs, whether it be charters or vouchers. Early on, the administration was saying charter or vouchers. What you would notice over the last year and a half is they don't even talk about charters anymore. It's all vouchers. So that was one thing. The other thing they wanted was just new line item budgets to fund vouchers. They haven't gotten that yet. They did get a change in the tax code that allows people to put money in education savings accounts tax-free, and then pay for private education for it. So they've been playing with the money, right? How can we use that federal flow of money to incentivize people to go to private school, or quite simply to actually give more money to people who are already in private school? Also in the tax bill, if again, getting a little bit wonky, but they put basically what I would call a penalty on state and local, or a cap on state and local taxes that you can file for on your deductions. Well, we all know that most of our state and local taxes go to public education. So the more your state spends on that, will no longer, I should say, high expenditures on public education are no longer going to get you huge tax breaks on your federal tax return. They took that away. But most recently, what's been getting the most news is the COVID aid, right? Sort of Congress has spent, $1 trillion or so on responding to COVID, and huge chunks of that went to public education. And Betsy DeVos has tried, to everyone's surprise, I don't know whether we should have been surprised, has tried to find gray area where she could, and then just make up stuff where she couldn't find gray area to take that CARES Act, that COVID money, and spend it on private education. And it is shocking that someone would say, I know, well, she didn't say I know, but I guess I can say, I know that money, because I can read the text of the legislation that Congress passed, was designed for poor kids and public schools. And she has been trying to take large chunks of that and go, well, but we ought to spend it on private schools anyway. And also there's some discretionary funds that governors had that was clearly set up to respond to COVID, clearly set up for public schools. And she's convincing governors to take that money and spend it on private school vouchers and not give any of it to the public schools. So, we're in this radical time where Congress thought she would put the pandemic ahead of her personal policy agenda. But what we've seen is her trying to exploit a pandemic to continue to pursue the policies that have been floundering for 3 years in Congress.
And this coming from an education secretary who hasn't spent a single day in a public education environment. That's the other thing about this. Yeah, I mean, she obviously doesn't care about public schools. She's obviously against them. We all knew that from the get-go. She's entirely unqualified. That's pretty obvious from the get-go. I guess what I never appreciated was how dogged and determined and underhanded she would be. I mean, she really does take the cake in terms of not really caring what the rules are, and trying to do what she wants to at every turn. I mean, even looking at, I think the most obvious example of her callousness, or the two of the most obvious ones, are one, we've got a federal loan forgiveness program. This is outside of K through 12, but federal loan forgiveness program for folks that were defrauded by these private schools, and Betsy DeVos had to be put in contempt of court, basically, to make her stop collecting those loan payments. It's just crazy. And then this past week she said, that there was some good things about COVID, or it's a good thing we had COVID because it's forced education changes we wouldn't have otherwise made. I mean, how could those words come out of your mouth that someone either COVID has been a good thing for education? They can only come from someone who is so callous and so ignorant that all they really care about is private education. Well, it's emblematic of this entire administration. I mean, unfortunately that's what we've got right now. So, on another story, November can't come soon enough. Before we let you go, though, your book points out that public education has enjoyed strong bipartisan support. Should we be hopeful that this kind of support can withstand what the Trump administration is hoping to accomplish?
I mean, I think that we can expect that average everyday folks in the bipartisan support they have for public education can withstand this administration. I think, and you mentioned the election. I think the thing we have to take into account is that public education has always been so bipartisan that it has never been a huge issue at the presidential elections level, right? There's always discussions about it during the primaries, but by the time we get to the presidency, each side has nominated a person who both support public education, both talk about how to help it. They may have different ideas about how to best do that, but they both support public education, right? I mean, George Bush was not a hater of public education. He may have had different ideas about accountability, but he didn't hate it, right? And so I think what we have is a world in which we have assumed that our public officials, and I think this applies to the state level too, that we're sort of all on the same page when it comes to public education. But what we've seen over the last 4 years in particular is the weaponization of education policy in an incredibly divisive way. And I think voters of both parties, Democrat or Republican, need to think about their public schools when they go to the ballot box in a way that, quite frankly, they just haven't had to do in a long time. Because if they ignore the reality, right, a middle-of-the-road voter, or maybe even a voter who is a solid Republican, right, I think this election they have to ask themselves, what's more important to me? Is it the public school system that got me where I am in life? Is it the public school system that is going to, propel my children, hopefully to better and brighter things than I achieved? Or is it, small federal government, deregulation, et cetera, right? Because now what we really have is an administration that is willing to throw away public education. And if you're a voter, even if you're a Republican, you've really got to weigh, I think, what's most important to you. Some of this economic conservatism or your child's public education. And if that's a question, well, that's a personal question that folks need to answer for themselves. I just want to alert them that is the question that they need to ask because this administration is off the rails when it comes to public education.
Title of the book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. The author, Derek Black, professor at the University of South Carolina Law School, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Derek, we certainly appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Sounds great. Love to be back on.
Well, thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, why one Georgia congressman believes Democrats can turn the Senate to their advantage in Georgia's upcoming runoffs.
And so all eyes on Georgia for sure now for a couple of reasons. So let's start with Joe Biden becoming the first Democrat to carry Georgia in a presidential election in 28 years, not since Bill Clinton as a Democrat won Georgia. How did it happen? What's the Georgia miracle, Congressman?
Well, Georgia, as the South is, it is going through changes. It is evolving. And, it's a youthful area, Georgia. Many people moving in, new attitudes, a potpourri of people. And as these young people become eligible to vote, they are voting. And so we saw a lot of young people voting in Georgia. As you know, Stacey Abrams registered 800,000 voters. Most of them were youthful voters, first-time voters. And she did that between 2018 and 2020, a Herculean effort. And those voters showed up to the polls and they voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and that's how it got done.
So it was a real grassroots operation led by, I'm sure, many people, but largely by Stacey Abrams?
Yeah, I would have to attribute the lion's share of the work to produce this conversion from red to blue in the presidential election. I would have to attribute it largely to Stacey Abrams and her network of activists.
And Congressman, there was all the, with Stacey Abrams and her gubernatorial, all the talk, the reality of voter suppression in Georgia. So I guess it's even more remarkable given the forces who were trying to suppress the vote.
Well, our current governor, Brian Kemp, was the Secretary of State who oversaw the 2018 election while he ran for governor. And in his run-up for that race, he did a lot to, as he would say, cull the voting rolls of voters who he, for whatever reason, he just felt like they should not be voting. And so people who had not voted in recent elections, he purged those names from the voter rolls. He disallowed registrations of voters. Some tens of thousands of registration forms of voters that had filled out registration forms got lost. And so it was a host of techniques that Brian Kemp used to tamp down the activity of people registering and wanting to exercise their right to vote. For instance, he probably purged about 100 and he purged 1.5 million names from the voter rolls. As Stacey Abrams was registering 400,000 voters, he is culling those names from the voter roll. So as quickly as voters could be registered, they were being kicked off. And, so just a whole host of things that Brian Kemp did, and it produced a victory for him to the tune of about 54,000 votes. He won that election. And so since he has been out of the Secretary of State's office, you've had a newcomer, Brad Raffensperger. He has not been aggressive in terms of removing voters from the voter rolls. And Stacey Abrams ramped up her registration efforts. And as a result, we saw the turnout that we saw.
Right. So in the eyes, at least of some people, the election in Georgia, while called for Joe Biden, is not over yet. The recount is underway, or the audit, whatever you want to call it. What are you concerned about that, Congressman? Do you think this could change the outcome of the presidential election in Georgia?
Well, there have been a number of counties that have reported back their results after doing the hand recount of the paper that comes out of the electronic voting machines. And in those counties that completed their recount, there appears to be no appreciable difference between the tallies that were announced after the election and the recounted ballots. And so with that having taken place, I don't think the prospects for large changes in the numbers of votes can be expected. So with a 14,000 vote lead at this time that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have, I'm not expecting the recount to result in a overturning of that margin. And so I do believe that the Biden-Harris ticket will be declared the winner after the recount, and those votes will be certified as is called for under state law this Friday, November 20th.
November 20, got it. And do you believe that this augurs well for Georgia in the future? Maybe not just for Georgia, but across the South?
Yeah, I believe that Georgia is leading the South into the New South. And it's a South where, as opposed to being a place where people were denied their right to vote, it's a place where people who have been disenfranchised are actually turning out in record numbers and being the difference between who wins and who loses these elections. So Black people, brown people, Asians getting out to vote, largely young people voting for Joe Biden, and also progressive thinking white people. With that kind of collaboration, you got the result that you got on November 3rd, and we're looking to duplicate that on January 5th.
Well, that's what I was going to get to next, whether the enthusiasm we saw for November 3rd will translate into enthusiasm, keep that level of enthusiasm up for January 5. You believe so?
I believe that the enthusiasm remains. I don't think there will be a period where we go to sleep. The people know that there are 48 Democrats who've been elected to serve in the Senate, and we still have 2 that remain. And they understand that we have a 100-person Senate. And with those numbers, those 2 seats that have to be filled coming out of Georgia will give equality to the number of people from both parties who are in the Senate. And that leaves the new Vice President, Kamala Harris, there to break the tie. The people understand that. That's a simple concept, simple equation. And it's being driven home every day by activists on the street, and what people hear on the TV and radio. It's being talked about. It's all over social media. And however people get their news, they're getting that message that the balance of power in the Senate is at stake. And Georgia has the ability, we have it in our hands to determine which way our nation goes. And so I believe that these young people who have had pent-up frustration since 2016, they were able to exercise it in 2018, but it was snuffed out. But they came back in 2020 in even larger numbers and prevailed. And so now they've tasted victory. I think that they will come back out and close the deal on January 5th.
Congressman, John Ossoff, who ran before, we got to know him a little bit, but most Americans don't know him well. And with Reverend Warnock, he's really a new face on the national scene. Tell us a little bit about, both of these men well, their strengths as a candidate and their appeal to voters. But start with John Ossoff and tell us about both of them.
John Ossoff is a smart and accomplished young man.
He worked for you one time, didn't he?
He did. Yeah. He certainly did. In fact, my wife has a picture of John Ossoff with a sign. He was about 4 years old, and he was under the arm of Mayor Maynard Jackson of Atlanta. So John Ossoff, that was his first race that his mother and father put him in, was helping out Maynard Jackson get elected to mayor, and he was 4 years old. And so at that time, John has been involved in numerous campaigns. In fact, he was involved in mine when I first ran for election, and he was a key individual at the age of 18 in my campaign. Pretty much put together our social media thrust at that time. This was 2006. And so he was ahead of his time then, and he has remained ahead of his time since then, just doing a lot of things, a lot of accomplishments as a young man. Now he's married, homeowner, businessman. He's had a well-defined matriculation in life since getting out of school, and he's ready for this job. A young white guy, and here's a young black man, Raphael Warnock, who came up through the projects of Savannah, Georgia, the first of his 11 siblings, the only one of his 11 siblings to obtain a degree from a 4-year institution. He has come up from on the hard side of the mountain, became a minister, became a pastor. Now he has been at Ebenezer Baptist Church for the last 15 years as the senior pastor of the church that was pastored by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Martin Luther King Sr. So he's coming out of a tradition of civil activism and human rights activism, and he has worn that mantle during his 15 years as a pastor, and now he is bringing that experience to bear as a candidate for the U.S. Senate. And it just so happens we have in the New South a young black man and a young white man both running for these 2 seats. It's very symbolic. They are very close, working partners together. They realize that the stakes are high, and they are showing what people can do when we are unified and moving forward towards the goal of human rights and prosperity for all of Georgia's people, which needs to translate into the people of this world. These are world thinkers and world doers, and we have the opportunity to elect them at the same time to come into Congress and move this nation forward. And I'm so proud of both of them.
Do you feel good about the chances of winning both Senate seats?
Yeah, I do. Everyone recognizes that this is a package deal. If one wins, the other wins. If they both win, then America wins. And that's the goal, for both of them to win. We need both of them to win for this nation to be able to move forward. Otherwise, we'll have Mitch McConnell presiding over another 2 years of gridlock, where nothing gets out of the cemetery of the Grim Reaper. And he will do that because that's the game that he played with Barack Obama. The night that Barack Obama was inaugurated to be our president, and we were mired in the depths of the Great Recession. We have Mitch McConnell and Newt Gingrich and others plotting to make Barack Obama a first-term president, even though the nation was threatened with going into depression. The only thing they were thinking about was regaining power. And so they obstructed everything that President Obama put forward. But fortunately, Barack Obama had a United States House of Representatives, and he had a United States Senate that was under Democratic control, and we were able to move this nation forward. But that window was there for only 2 years. Mm-hmm. And so after that first 2 years, everything Barack Obama tried to do, it was obstructed by Mitch McConnell. So that is what he does. And he will continue to do that as a leader of the Senate if given that opportunity, to the peril of the nation. And I don't understand why he would do it, but that's what he has done. And I don't have a lot of hope that he will do anything different if he is wielding the gavel in the Senate.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in just a minute. But before we leave the Senate, so David Perdue, Senator Perdue, has said that he will not take part in any debate with Jon Ossoff between now and January 5. What's that tell us about Perdue?
Well, it tells us that, like the products that the Perdue meat packing company, there's a Perdue Meats company. I don't think it's associated with David Perdue, but they deal in chickens. And so Perdue is living up to that product. He's living up to the chicken that Perdue Farms produces. And I think it's telling. He has gone through 6 years as a senator without holding a single town hall meeting for his constituents in Georgia. And so he doesn't like to be seen and heard. He likes to run under the radar as if people don't know that he's there. And then he can do all of his stock trading and other personal dealing undetected by anyone. And so when the covers are taken off and he's forced to show his face and come out, what he likes to do is put on that blue jeans jacket and come out and parade around as a country boy. But everybody knows that he's a silk stocking corporate raider who closes up businesses and shuts down jobs and reaps the benefits of millions of dollars of hedge fund activity. And, that's the kind of guy he is. And so he doesn't want the people to see him and hear him because he really doesn't have anything useful to say to the working people of Georgia. And that's why he doesn't want to debate.
Yeah, got it. So I want to come back to the Senate. And certainly, even as we speak, President-elect Biden has put forth his plan for rebuilding the economy, for tackling the coronavirus, for getting our leadership in the world back on climate change, for dealing with the continuing reality of systemic racism in this country. He's got some big plans. He's going to try to get things done. Do you think he will get any cooperation at all from Congress to get things done for the American people?
Well, the House of Representatives will definitely be working with the Biden administration to help that administration make things better for the people of this country. Building America back better is what he has pledged to do, and we will work with him in the House of Representatives. If we have a Senate that is under new leadership, then I believe we'll see the nation be able to move forward. If Mitch McConnell remains the majority leader of the Senate, then we can look for another 2 years of gridlock. Mm-hmm. And the whole thing will be to make Democrats in the House and the president look bad so that they can have a hope of regaining a majority in the House of Representatives. And then if they can do that, then they'll be looking at another 2 years of gridlock so that we can blame it on so that we can blame it on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, so that we can elect a Republican president, perhaps even Donald Trump himself get reelected in 2024. That is their game plan, nothing other than power for themselves at the expense of the people of this nation and the prosperity of the nation itself.
So were you to sit down with the president-elect today, Joe Biden, has certainly a lot on his plate. What do you think should be his top priorities going in?
Well, we've got to get control of the raging coronavirus. COVID-19 is rampaging throughout the nation. It's shutting down the economy as it closes out life itself. So we've got to get a handle on the on COVID-19, reduce the spread, bring back our economy, create millions of new jobs, both in healthcare as well as in producing new energy, green, renewable energy, so that we can take care of climate change in this world, do our part. That's what we have to do as America. And rebuild this country, its infrastructure, everything from ports to airports to roads and bridges to the railroad capacity and network in this country, to broadband to every nook and cranny of the country. And, there is a lot of money that needs to be spent by the federal government to trigger that kind of renewal of our infrastructure in this country. And in the process of doing that, we're going to create millions of high-paying middle-class jobs and put Americans back to work, restore the middle class, and create a vibrant space for America in the global economy.
And Congressman, looking at the House, certainly there were prospects ahead of time that Democrats might actually pick up 10 to 15 seats. It turned out to be just the opposite. And the Democrats coming into the new Congress with maybe a margin of 5 or 6 seats over the Republicans, one of the most narrow margins in decades. Is that going to cramp the ability to get things done? And do you think it'll mean any change in the leadership, or should it, or any change in the message from members of Congress running for office?
Well, there was a lot of irrational exuberance that flowed from the 2018 elections when 31, I believe, seats that went for Trump in 2016 went into the Democratic column in 2018 with the election of members of the House of Representatives. And so the press and others talked a lot about what they thought would happen in 2020, but it did not pan out. And that was due, of course, to polling that the press relied upon, which turned out to be inaccurate. And so as a result, there were some Republican districts that were won by Democrats in 2018, but when Trump was on the agenda again, when he was on the ballot in 2020, those Republicans who didn't come out in 2018 came out in 2020, and those Democrats who were elected in 2018 unfortunately lost their seats. But those were Republican seats, highly contested. We'll continue to contest those seats because demographics and changes are happening in those districts, and those districts can one day be won again by Democrats. So we'll continue to contest that. But meanwhile, our margin is not as great for the 117th Congress as it was for the 116th. We'll have to find a way of making progress in our caucus, and I believe we will do so under the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, who is a brilliant leader. We all know she's not going to be there forever, but for now she's there. I don't expect there'll be any problems with her getting reelected to Speaker of the House to lead us in the 117th.
Bill Press with Congressman Hank Johnson, who represents Georgia's 4th Congressional District. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Derek W. Black, Stanley Greenberg, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.